to start, what we are going to look at is things like this. I hope your eyes hurts a bit, because there's something wrong here. If you do this live, you are going to have a problem. It's going to be painful. You can also stumble across situations like this. Your eyes should hurt a bit now as well, because there's someone that has been a bit of a too much lead hacker here. They have not done an AND operation, they have done a bool operation. So this is not if foo is true and if bar is true. It's take all the bits of foo and all the bits of bar and join them together, and if one of the bits match, then it's going to be true. If one of the bits doesn't match, then it's going to be false, and that's typically not at all what you want to get in this situation. You can do that, but then you're such bool much hacker, and we don't like you. You could do this as well, and there's probably someone at your company that has done this. They have done just a one-liner to fix your pretty little solution, but it's kind of hard to know what's going on here. There's some inline if, there's some functioning, returning new promises, with async methods in the middle of it. This works, probably, but you will be pretty confused about how it works and why it works, so no, question mark. We don't want this. So let's present a theory here. Mistakes and confusion caused by the slides that we previously saw that will somewhere down the line result in bugs. And when we get bugs, we get frustrated, because when we get a bug, we need to solve it, and we need to dig through this code. We need to understand what this smart person that made the one-liner, or with the smart person that made the bool operation, what they really intended to do, and that makes us sad. Such frustration makes us sad. And also it may perhaps cause the website to crash and cause some business. If we're talking about robots or something, it may cause a world war and we may have people dying or something. But the main point is that we get frustrated and we get sad, and that's not something that we want. So let's make it us self-happy and avoid those situations, basically. So let's figure out how to solve the situation, how to prevent these one-liners from happening, and how to prevent these lead hacker much bool operations from actually occurring in our code. We don't want us to see that when we open a new file. And we can do that in a couple of different ways. We can employ linting and static code analysis, and that's what we're mostly going to look at today. We can also achieve it through better documentation and version control. If you actually can understand through the commit messages why a person added a bool operation, or why a person added such a long one-liner and didn't write it in any other way, then we can perhaps resolve the situation. We can, of course, add tests, but tests isn't the easiest way of finding a mistake where you have added one character too much or one character too little. It's a bit overkill for that. So, and it's a whole another topic. How should you build your test? What's the best way of building tests? Should you use BDD? Should you use TDD? Should you do nothing at all or everything at once? So yes, we're going to leave this out of these presentations today, because there's lots simpler ways of solving most of your problems than actually doing tests. And of course, we're developers, automate everything. That's the way that we want to approach things. If we can avoid working, let's avoid working. Start with linting. What is linting, we might ask? It's something that's becoming increasingly popular, but it actually has its origin in a program for C. This is what Wikipedia says. Lint was the name originally given to a particular program that flagged some suspicious and non-portable constructs likely to be bugs in C. That program was named Lint. And because the compilers couldn't flag for these problems, but you knew that they would be probably coding in these ways would probably result in bugs down the line, then you wanted a program to ensure that people never used these suspicious ways of coding and never used these non-portable constructs, because if they were getting into your code, you would somewhere down the line get a problem, and why not avoid them before they can ever happen. Wikipedia also says that lint tools generally perform static analysis of source code. Unlike tests, tests are executed. You write your tests in code, and the code is executed, and either your assertions of what the code should result in comes out true, or your assertions comes out false, and the test will either work or fail. But in linting, you never run any of your code. You run you send your code into a program that checks for patterns, and if it finds patterns that are suspicious or likely to cause some kind of bugs down the line, or is just purely bad practice, like using a bit operation, then it will say that you are probably making a mistake here. Even if you think that you're a very elite coder, you're probably making a mistake. And let's see what Douglas Crockford says about this, because Douglas Crockford wrote the first big linting tool for JavaScript, which was basically named JSLint. Nice and simple. He says that JavaScript is a sloppy language, but inside it there's an elegant language. And using JSLint, you avoid the sloppiness of a language so that you can use the elegance of the language. And employing this, when you employ JavaScript in a bigger organization, while you yourself might avoid the sloppiness, there's probably always some coder in the team that at one point in time might find a new cool feature and use that feature without realizing that it's actually sloppy code and without realizing the problems that might occur down the line. So with something like JSLint, that coder will know that that's not a good idea. People have found out that it is a bad idea to use that kind of code, and the coder will be basically stopped from continuing, or at least will be alerted to that fact and have to explain himself or herself. There's also this little notice on every JSLint page that it will of course hurt your feelings. You don't want a computer program to tell you that you're wrong, because you're obviously not wrong. You're super awesome, and whatever you do is probably the most perfect thing someone has ever done. But this program will tell you otherwise. Thing is, though, that JSLint was pretty opinionated in its day. Douglas Crockford, if you have ever heard him or read something that he has written, like JavaScript, the good parts and the bad parts, he is a pretty opinionated person. And JSLint isn't very configurable. So either you were stuck with Douglas Crockford opinion of the world, like semicolons should be used. Some people think that semicolons should not be used in JavaScript, that semicolon is a disease in JavaScript or something. So out of that frustration, the most common linting tool of today, JSHint, was born. It's a less opinionated, and most importantly, it's configurable. So if there is a linting rule where it says that this piece of code is something that you should not do, and you think that this is actually something that one should do, like comma first or something, where you do in your variable declarations, you don't put the commas on the last line of every variable declarations, but the comma on the first line, so that you get everything nicely aligned. That's something that you can configure JSHint to enforce and accept, but by default it won't, and with JSLint you can't ever get it to accept it, because that's not the way Douglas Crockford does things. And most importantly, JSHint focuses on finding mistakes and potential bugs. Whenever you code something, but that may result in something that's wrong. So all of the first, of the 3 examples I took in the beginning, the first 2 would be detected by JSHint. Bools is in 99% of all cases, or bool operations is a mistake where you intended to write 2 ampersands, but you mistakenly forgot one of the ampersands and did something you didn't intend to do. That's something that JSHint picks up. It also picks up some syntax errors, which we have always had some code crash because we missed a single little character, and no non-coder actually understands why how that can actually crash the entire site. Yeah. Especially in PHP. So this is what the JSHint says. Please note that while static code analysis can spot many different kinds of mistakes, it can't detect whether your program is actually correct, fast, or has memory leaks. That's actually one of the big points of linters. as linters don't execute a program, it can't actually tell you whether it works, but it can tell you whether it is having or is likely to have bugs down the line. And since it actually doesn't run your code, it can be done much faster and much more securely. I mean, you don't want to run everyone's program everywhere because they might have a bug which kind of deletes all of your hard drive or something, known to happen. But let's look at how to use it. Using it is very simple. You just install it globally, like with any other npm install, and then you get a command line tool which you can actually just send in and say, JSHint, I want you to lint this file with the default configuration. And like any other Unix program, this will exit with an arrow code or not an arrow code, and will also tell a human readable message of whether it actually succeeded or not. So that for the cool hackers. For normal people, we can use editor plugins. Even for the cool people with Vim, we can use editor plugins, which actually, whenever you save, it will run your code through the linter and tell you whether you added a mistake or whether you not added a mistake. So right at the minute when you save, you know whether you have done something stupid or done a syntax error or something else. And as we will look at later, it can be built into task managers like Grunt and Gulp to ensure that no mistakes ever get through to your repositories or to any other computer, so that you can look like a super good coder to everyone else while you're actually doing tons of mistakes at your own computer. That's what we want. You configure JSHint through a .jshint rc file, and this is actually one of the JSHint files from one of my projects. JSHint has a default configuration, which is what they think is good. But in some cases, like bitwise true, we don't want bit operations. But camel casing was something that I apparently didn't want it to enforce. Also, something with late definitions of no func. And this shows how configurable it is. And this is something that where you can set rules. You can define the rules that you're personally comfortable with, or you can define the rules that your company and team is comfortable with, and because a linter shouldn't ever give a false positive. You should always agree with your linter in your team. If someone in the team sits and bangs their head to it on the desk because they disagree with the linter and gets like interrupted by the linter each and every minute when they are coding, then you have done something wrong with your rules, and you should probably adopt the rules to that person's coding standard, because that person is probably more frustrated by a poorly configured linter than they are with. It will cause more problems if a coder sees the linter as an enemy rather than a friend. But even if you do this bitwise, even if you prohibit bitwise operations, there might be cases where you actually need bitwise operations. They are good at times. And then you can use comments. And actually, you need to use JSHint comments in your setup generally, because if you have a project with both Node.js code and front-end code, then the Node.js files should require another variable. This actually checks that you don't use variables that you're not allowed to use. But in a Node.js environment and in a browser environment, you have different global variables. So you need to define whether you're in a Node environment or whether you're in a browser environment, so that the JSHint knows what to lint against. And you can also apply other file-specific or function-specific rules by doing this here. And you can also add or remove globals. So for example, you can remove the promise global, and that sounds weird perhaps, but in IO.js you have a promise global. In Node 0.10 you don't have a promise global. And if you want to polyfill the promise global, then if you don't say that you explicitly know what you're doing, then JSHint will complain that, oh, you're overriding a default global. Do you really know what you're doing? You shouldn't be overriding built-in JavaScript methods. So this is actually something you need to do if you want to polyfill the promise global. And then you can also plainly just ignore everything from JSHint for parts of your code or for a single line. So I mean, this is if you know that some code is valid, even though JSHint says that it is invalid, then it's good to be able to ignore it because it's just a hint. Not if you know what you're doing, then it's fine to opt out of it. And this is how it looked when you actually mark up a proper node.js file. You do JSHint node true to tell it that this is a node.js file. It should assume a node.js environment. Then you can opt out of a promise global. You do some new strict and other cool stuff. Of course, include low dash as you always do in your files. Can include the promise and yeah, some other cool code further down. This is how all of my Node.js files start with at least that part, probably often that part as well, often that one as well. It's always good to have some cool errors in your code as well. And if you actually do the bitwise operations, then this is from my actual code at where I work. We actually needed to do some bitwise operations because we needed to store a lot of data in MongoDB, and we didn't want to store it as strings or something like that. We wanted a small integer so that our MongoDB database wouldn't grow insanely large, because that would have performance impacts, of course. So in this specific function scope, we said, okay, in this specific function scope, I know what I'm doing. In this specific function scope, we do allow bitwise operations, and we do the bitwise operation here, so that all of the other parts of our code base could use the has flag method rather than actually doing the bitwise operations, because invoking a method is far less likely to have a coding error than it is to accidentally just write 1 ampersand and 2 ampersands. So basically, with this linting, if you do this for all of your files, if you especially do this for all of your files and run the linter quite often, add it to your editor, then you will at least avoid all of the coding mistakes and all of the basic error-prone code that you can do. So if we concluded in the beginning that no linting would lead to frustration and you sitting and crying at your office, we can now conclude that with linting you will be a happy coder and you can go and party. So that's coding mistakes, the first part of it. With linting, you avoid mistakes in your code. But there's also other parts. I spoke about documentation in the beginning, and it's not just bugs and mistakes that we should avoid in our code. We should also avoid sloppy coding styles in our code. Because a good coding style will result in less confusion. If you know that how the code is going to look like. I mean, there are some very weird coding styles in the JavaScript world. There is some code where you open it up, it takes a few minutes before you actually understand what the code is doing. So especially in a team environment at your company, you would want all of the code to look more or less the same so that you always know what to expect. And in an open source environment, even more, because you don't want each and every person's pull request to your open source code to have their own coding style, so that after a year or two, you have 10 different people's coding style in your project. And that's mostly, it makes the code easy to read, but it's mostly that it actually represents the changes better in version control. There's nothing worse in version control than someone changing all of the white space of your file at the same time when they are changing an if statement. If they do, you can't really know what they actually did change, because the diff will be for the entire file. If they change from like tab indentation to space indentation, then everything is lost. And especially if you have multiple people working on the same repository and you try to merge things, then if someone changed all of the coding style of one file needlessly, then when the other person comes and want to merge their pull request, they will have a conflict and they would need to rebase, and then you need to figure out what did actually change, what didn't actually change, and that's just messy and causes confusion. And so consistent coding style makes version control representations better, and therefore causes less confusion in the projects, and therefore causes less bugs. Yeah, history. I mean, you want to know what the person actually intended to do. Version control is pretty much storytelling. You should tell the story of what you are doing to the project. that's what all commits should be like. You should be able to read through what the person intended to do. Then the code should hopefully match the intention of the coder, but it's not always that the version of the actual code matches the intention. We can always have good intentions, but they don't always shine through. So consistent style leads to good tracking and documentation of changes, and that in turn leads to less confusion regarding code, and that's good. So let's look at how we can enforce a better coding style. First step is editor config. This is something super simple. This is whitespace linting, so that you can enforce that no one changes your whitespace. No one adds or removes trailing spaces. No one changes your indentation from 2 to 4 spaces, or changes your indentation from 2 spaces to tabs, or mixes tabs and space indentation. That's probably the worst. And also, yeah, lots of different things. It looks like this. You say that, oh, okay, this is even worse. If you actually work with Windows people, they sometimes use another end-of-line character. And when you then save it on a Mac, each and every line will have a different line ending, and you will have a diff for all of your files. So enforce that we should always use sane end of lines, always have a new line at the end of the files, always use space indentation, always 2 spaces, always UTF-8. That's hopefully something that everyone is doing today, but probably if you have some interesting PHP coder at your project, it could be different. And trim trailing whitespace. Always do that. I mean, Git itself complains partly if you don't. And this is something that actually hooks into most editors. So most editors will be auto-configured by this. If they see this file in a project and you have an editor config plugin in your editor, the editor will automatically configure the indentation to be 2 space and the line ending and all of that, so that it will get you will get it right from the start. Especially good if you switch between different projects with different style rules. It even has a Visual Studio plugin if you have someone that works with Visual Studio. And also it can be used through task managers. So, and it can be used in all files. I mean, most of these linters just works for JavaScript, but this one can be used for JSON, HTML. You could probably even add your README to this, but I don't really see a point of linting your README file for trailing spaces. It could be going a bit too far. But that's a good start. If with this one you know that the white space is good in all places. But let's go further and also ensure that the JavaScript style is also good. And for that there's JSCS, JavaScript coding style library, which programmatically enforces your style guide. And this is a very good complement to JSHint, as JSHint is only for coding mistakes. This is only for the style. Currently, JSHint also includes some style checks, but they are working towards removing all style-related checks from JSHint and have all of the style-related checks be in JSCS instead. And just like JSHint, this is also very configurable. Unlike JSHint, this has no default rules. Instead, it has a lot of presets, but also unlike JSHint, it can actually autocorrect. You can, if you find an error and you are too lazy to actually correct the error yourself, which I actually would encourage you to do, because that way you probably would learn to not do that same error over and over again. But if you have a big project which you want to change from one coding style to another, then it can actually change it automatically. And when it comes to the presets, there's from Google, Douglas Crockford, jQuery, lots of different presets. And the presets are just a bundle of rules. You could create all of the rules from yourself, but if you look at these presets, they are quite big, so you probably don't want to go through all of JSCS rules. So once again, this is the JSCS file from one of my projects, actually the one that we use at my work, at my job. We took Crockford's because we thought that Douglas Crockford's, even if he is very opinionated, it actually was the one that looked closest to how we wanted the code. And then we added some, like, Douglas Crockford for some reason uses 4-space indentation, but 2-space indentation seems to be more of a norm today. And then also there's some things like disallow trailing comma. If you have an object definition, then having a trailing comma at the last array or object property, that's something that will crash old Internet Explorer browsers, so something that you shouldn't do in browser code. But since we're in node.js, we can pretty much disregard that one because it makes your diffs, the changes in your version control look much smaller if you add a new property to an object, if you just change the line with the property and don't also have to add a comma on the line before. So we have done some such alterations, but basically this makes it very easy to start with, and eventually we might decide to like add more and more presets so that we eventually could remove Crockfords and say like that we have a like blog login preset or something. To get started with, it's just as simple. Install the global, point it to your project. I think that I actually forgot something here because if you have a JSCS configuration file, you could probably do this. If you don't have it, you would probably have to tell it what rules to actually check against. And then there's editor plugins. I'm not sure there's one for Visual Studio here, but Sublime and Atom. Not one for Vim either, I think. But I mean, Atom users, yay. And Grunt and Gulp at least. You also have comments here, so that you can enable and disable and like if you copy and paste a solution from Stack Overflow, I don't know, you shouldn't perhaps do that, but just copy and paste it straight into your code. But if you for some reason have to get some code into your larger file, which violates some of the rules, you can either disable it completely and then re-enable it, or you can just disable the few rules that aren't valid for that specific file or that specific part of a file. This is also useful if you actually go from one style guide to another. Some changes will cause huge, if you, for example, change the indentation, you perhaps don't want to commit that, as that will cause tons of conflicts and you will have a rough relationship with your colleagues. So that's JSCS, editor config, and JSHint. That's a pretty good start, but there are some alternatives. This is one that is getting a bit popular in the open source world right now. Someone has done a standard JavaScript coding style, which is kind of an impossible task, but nonetheless, the feature of this one is that it isn't configurable, because it should be a one-click solution. You install it, you run it, you're done. You have a standard compliant coding style. The one thing that's a bit of a problem is that there is no common coding style within the JavaScript community, so this is standard in a subset of the JavaScript community. And that's evident by the fact that this standard enforces you to not use semicolons at the end of your lines, which probably hints that these people come from the Ruby world. Yeah. But it intends that you should use this and only this, rather than having to configure your JSHint and JSCS rules, because as we saw, it requires some configuration to get started, and especially in the open source world, it's rather nice if all of the rules are the same for two projects, so that you don't have slightly different rules for two different projects. And of note could be that this is actually uses another linter that's called ESLint. And happy news is that someone forked it and made a semi-standard checker that actually uses semicolons. So if this is the standard or that is the standard, who knows? Something standard about it, at least. It has a cool logo that you can add to your GitHub README file and tell everyone that, hey, I'm more standard than the other guys. And as I said, it uses ESLint, which is the big alternative to using the JSHint and JSCS combo. It contains both the classic linting of finding mistakes. It also contains the style guide checks, and it's also extendable. So you could add your own linting rules. I haven't used this myself, but you can add your own checks. So if you find out that one coder in the team, or a subset of the coders in your team, or everyone but you do something that they shouldn't be doing, you can write your own little check that prohibits them from doing that and doing everything your own way instead. And they actually include some such extensions themselves that can actually check for Node.js specific stuff. So I actually think that you can add a check that prohibits some certain modules from being used, or I think you can also prohibit non-asynchronous methods from being used, which is probably good in a web project. If someone uses a synchronous method in a web project, they are probably doing something wrong and will probably hurt your performance pretty radically. So it could be worth, if you haven't chosen a linter or a style guide check for your own project and you feel like you want some extensibility and only want to use one tool rather than 2 or 3, then you could perhaps check out this one instead. But there are also other kinds of checks. Rather than having an extendable tool, you could have many tools. I mean, that's kind of a Unix philosophy of having many small tools that are doing one thing good and not more than one little thing. And Dependency-Check is one such specialized linter. It ensures that all of the modules that you use in your code are in your package.json, and also that warns you if all of the dependencies in your package.json isn't used in your code. One nice thing about JSHint is actually that JSHint will warn. You can have JSHint warn you if you have variables defined that you actually don't use. And if you have that, you will. So if you included a dependency and later don't use that dependency, JSHint will tell you why do you include this module when you're not using it. So then you remove the require, and then Dependency-Check will say, hey, why do you have this module in your package.json if you don't use it? So then Dependency-Check will make you also remove it from your package.json. So it's a kind of a good flow for getting rid of code that you don't use anymore. First, JSHint for the variables, then Dependency-Check for the actual dependency checks. But the most important thing is that you actually don't push code live, which don't include your dependencies, because that's a very easy mistake to make. Even your automated tests will run perfectly locally, but it won't run perfectly on the other servers because it won't know what code to install. And it's super simple to install, and it's created by one of those, Max Ogden. He probably likes the standard JS project, but it's also currently co-maintained by me because I felt that it was pretty nifty and sent some PRs his way. But looking so the first thing that we looked at was linting. The second thing was to ensure that our coding style was good, so that because with a consistent coding style we will get better version control, and with better version control we will get less confusion because we will know what people's intent with their code actually was, and we will avoid merge conflicts and everything like that. So we will probably have less confusion and less bugs. But the problem with these 2 first steps is that so far you have to run them manually, or you have to rely on a editor plugin, and that's pretty error prone. So we want to automate it so that it's always run and you can't ever forget to not run it.